Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, today again some information on some parts of basics of business administration, and let us have a look what today is our topic, and it will be Chapter 12, International Trade Relations and the Rules for International Trade, and in the beginning again some literature recommendations if you have some free hours and want to spend them in a reasonable way. There might be some nice introductory small booklets, for example by NALICA, the World Trade Organization, from Oxford University Press, or something on the European Union, an introduction by Pinder and Usherwood, on European Union law, an introductory overview by Anthony Arnold. And just if you are interested in the wider perspectives or some more remote background, then you could also have a look on literature on the United Nations, on the principles of international law, or even on international relations. So there is naturally a vast amount of additional literature which you can find. That was just a very arbitrary selection. Now, let's talk about first the why. Why should you inform yourself about this chapter, international trade and its conditions? Well, if you look to textbooks on business administration, management, international trade, and so on, more and more management textbooks begin with describing economy as a global phenomenon. So more and more study programs somewhere just choose from the beginning onwards the perspective that business administration should be taught under a global perspective. For example, I put you down 2 books here where you can observe this from recent years. And that's the one thing. So globalization means you should know about international backgrounds. And the second thing is just a pragmatic thing, which brought me to the idea that it's urgently necessary to teach beginners the framework of international relations and what's going on. If you look to the present Brexit drama, for those who view the video later, this is now November 2020, when it's still not clear how the problems solved with the exit of Great Britain from the European Union can be dealt with. That showed sometimes that the acting politicians were not really familiar even with the problems and not in any way with the reasonable or necessary solutions which exist in the field. Or if they were familiar with that, they have hidden that very, very cleverly. So that seems to be that very often, very high in the hierarchy, there is not a proper knowledge of what's really the background of international relations and how they function. Good. Now, the basic beginning principle is naturally that states are sovereign. So, in theory, they can do whatever they want to, and especially there is no international rule that they would be would be forced to allow access to their territories to persons from outside or to goods from outside. So immigration can be limited, or imports of goods and services can be limited. Even movement of persons and goods into the other direction can be limited. So mobility of persons can be restricted. You remember here the rather bad example of the former Eastern German Republic, where it was nearly forbidden to leave the country. Or what also might exist, that exports of goods are limited. Happens rarely, but happens. For example, if there is a kind of crisis in the nutrition sector in your country and you want to hinder people from exporting food which is urgently needed in the inland to markets abroad just in order to earn more money. So it might be that from time to time also export might be limited, not rarely. Nowadays, in spite of all the nice principles that states are sovereign, most states allow imports and exports of goods, and also they also allow a certain degree of personal mobility cross-border. So there are several international treaties even where that was protected by legal rules, so where states oblige themselves voluntarily to change the conditions into the direction of greater liberalization. Especially here we have the treaties on the World Trade Organization. That's a bundle of treaties which guarantees certain procedures so that in the long run world trade contacts should become more and more liberal. Well, in general, nevertheless, states can still not be forced to liberalize their cross-border relations. They still retain the right to decide when they want to do it and under which conditions they allow cross-border economic or personal relations. So usually the conditions which they pose are motivated by they want to avoid bigger problems by liberalization. And so if you want to know what are the conditions of international contacts, especially of international trade relationships today, then probably you must know where the problems can be found. The basic problem is usually that there are different legal conditions in different countries. So in countries A and B, you will have different tax laws, you will have different safety standards for products, the environmental protection rules which restrict the ways how you can produce are different in country A and B, the wages and the labor laws, under which conditions you can fire or hire employees, all that is different and many other things are different too. So that affects the laws or the cost of the products from country A, and it naturally also determines the cost of the products produced in B. And now if A has lower costs due to the legal environment there than country B, then it might be possible that country A suppliers can undercut, can compete far better just because of these conditions than the suppliers of country B, and so that the people from country B can no longer sell their products. Furthermore, it can happen that if safety standards deviate, the products from country A, which do not follow the legal requirements or the standards which the customers in B are used to, that these products might turn out to be dangerous for customers from country B. Now, dangerous is probably something which you and I not directly understand. For example, a simple, plain, common ladder where you climb on to paint your walls can become a very dangerous instrument if, for example, there is a norm in your country that the steps between the steps of the ladder have a certain standardized distance. So probably when you climb up and down the ladder and paint your walls, subconsciously you are used to how much you have to lift your feet or to lower your feet in order to come to the next step of the ladder. And now imagine a foreign ladder with a different distance where you don't think about. You climb up, then you begin to look with your feet, place it down, probably 30 centimeters. Now you shift your weight and plop, fall down because there the distance between the steps is different. It's absolutely idiotic, but it happens, and so there might be even a need to agree on common standards in such simple things like these. And usually, by the way, if you read about standards like these, you probably think it absolutely is idiotic until you read about statistics on accidents and what caused them. And so sometimes one should think that the law probably only makes a standard if that seems to be necessary and not if it sounds idiotic, not only without a reason. So last but not least, there is sometimes also an egoistic motive why states keep their borders close to foreign products, because they might be motivated to shield their own producers from foreign competitors. So to keep the supply from abroad away in order to keep the prices up in the inland, or in order to sustain their own industry, which perhaps due to their lower quality could not survive in free competition. So for all these reasons, there might be trade barriers, restrictions, and the restrictions which you impose, especially to shield your market, might be two different ones. The first is a state might set a quantitative limit to foreign products. For example, there might be a decision this year not more than 50,000 cars from abroad are allowed to be imported into the inland. That would be a quantitative restriction. Or otherwise, it might be, and it is, a frequent trick just to make the foreign product artificially more expensive by charging an extra tax on goods which are imported from outside. So when they cross the border, a duty is levied on them, an extra tax, just because they don't come from the inland. That is a tax which inland products never have to bear, and that is the artificial advantage which you create for inland products. A customs duty. So, customs duties make products more expensive, price rises, nothing else happens, so you can still sell the identical product which you produce abroad if it complies with the necessary standards. The advantage for the producer is that you can indeed still produce the same machines for the inland and the customers abroad. So you can still profit from the economies of scale. That is from the effect that fixed costs go down per item the more you can produce. With quantitative restrictions, you may work in a similar way. Again, probably you can still produce or offer the same model of your product which you offer to your inland market, but now there is an upper limit to your success in numbers. For example, more than, let's say, 50,000 cars, you cannot sell to that country. Perhaps you compete with now not the suppliers of that country, but with the other suppliers from your own country and the world, because if only an import of 50,000 cars is allowed, then the question is no longer how you can sell cars there, but how you can sell more cars or can profit as much as you can from that given quantity, so that the others get problems with the limits, not you. Might be a problem. And last but not least, there are restrictions which follow from the different product and production standards. For example, there you will be forced to produce a variant of your own product, because imagine a machine which is constructed in a certain way is not accepted as safe by the authorities in country B, then you are not allowed to sell this specific product cross-border, you would have to create a variant which complies with the production standards and product standards of country B. And now that destroys a bit your economies of scale, because now you have to buy different machines, at least in part, for a certain part of the production. You have to create different designs. So many working steps have to be undertaken twice instead of only once. So your fixed costs go up, and so a cost advantage would be destroyed. And additionally, life gets far more complicated, because you have to work yourself into a mass of rules of the other country and check everything and make adaptations wherever the rules deviate. So that's highly complicated, and probably is the one means to close the market in hidden form, which is most effective, because that is the most difficult obstacle to circumvent for a foreign supplier. The problem, by the way, with these restrictions from product standards is they are not always meant as something which deliberately wants to shield your own market. Very often there are reasonable purposes behind, and so if you want to remove these obstacles for cross-border trade, you will have to debate if, for example, the production standards of the other country imply or mean sufficient protection, sufficient fulfillment of the purpose of your own rules. So if they can be regarded as equivalent, or if you really insist in that the foreign supplier has to create a variant of the product which complies with your own product and production standards. So now imagine you have to discuss that. Then you probably need somebody who is an expert in that sector, because only somebody who knows about the product and who has a wider experience in what can happen and what will be combined, where the product will be used. Only such a person can form a reasonable judgment on what can happen with that product. Only such a person can understand probably the purpose of a specific national rule and can then give recommendations if a foreign rule guarantees to fulfill the purpose of that rule of yours in a sufficient equivalent way or not. So liberalization of trade in such a cross-border area would require usually a vast amount of investigations into the background of the legal framework of those countries involved, and then to form a judgment if the other states' legal standards are equivalent, or if one has to insist in adaptations when the goods cross the border. So that is a huge amount of work. Now, usually when states after such negotiations come to the conclusion that the legal standards are equivalent, so that they can renounce on changes in the foreign product and can allow it to enter their own market without changes, then they could, for example, make a treaty which lays down that now and in the future foreign products from that other country in that sector of economy can cross freely the border because these standards are comparable enough. But then naturally you still have one legal risk. Once the treaty is signed, one of the countries could change its legislation and deviate from that common path. So you will also have to add to your treaty additional rules which secure that this does not happen. So you will have to agree not only that your present day rules are equivalent, but also you will have to insert mechanisms which secure that the levels are not lowered in a significant way. And so that's not always simple. Good. Now you will have to think about many obstacles, and we have them, as we saw from the overview over the different laws. We have them perhaps in the field of taxation, namely indirect taxes and customs duties. We have them in the field of production standards, and with all that must be dealt if you think about cross-border trade. Now, by the way, if you have obstacles for cross-border trade, those which result from taxation, especially from customs duties, are called tariff obstacles, or tariff restrictions. So where the taxation functions as a restriction for cross-border trade. And the other ones are the non-tariff restrictions, that are all the other ones, namely that which come from the production standards. In general, the public and the businesses prefer, if at all, then the tariff restrictions, because the restrictions which are made by a tariff just increase the price but let your whole production process unaffected. Now, let's think about how these trade obstacles work and what can be done against them. Let's begin with the most important and most well-known of them, customs duties. So that extra tax which is levied if a good from outside crosses the border and comes to the inland. Now, let's think about the matter. Country B, for example, you see here country A and country B, and country B has decided to levy a customs duty of 10% on the value of all the goods which are imported from country A. Oh, okay, simple and plain decision. Now, if you want to transform that into the real world, naturally you must get the information when and which goods come from country A or from somewhere else into your own country, and that is only possible if you monitor and control the border so that you can see every transport or every way in which a foreign good crosses the border. So if you establish a customs duty regime, then you necessarily need to control your borders, because you must find out whatever comes in. And one thing is absolutely clear, people don't like taxation, so if they can find a way to cross the border without paying the customs duty, then they will do so. And if they even find a legal way, they will do so even more. So one thing is clear, if there is a single loophole in the border control, then the whole system will break down. Then you can directly abolish your customs duty. If you do not want that, then you have to uphold a strict border control. That's clear. So here you see what would happen if there is only one single loophole in the border control of country B. Imagine here we have a small red line where the border checks don't work properly, and now after a while what is going to happen? That transaction does no longer take place, and now the good leaves country A, travels around the world, arrives at that place at the border where the control doesn't work properly, and plop, is imported by that alternative rule, free of customs duty, because there nobody could levy the duty properly, and plop, all the goods now take this route. After one did it successfully, the news spreads, and more of the sales from country A into country B will go that alternative route, and in the end country B will get no customs duties anymore. And if the customs duty also had the purpose to shield country B's suppliers against foreign low competition, low price competition, then you can now forget about that, because now the market is open to foreign competitors. Now, when you think about trade liberalization, naturally, it is often regarded as fair and reasonable that customs duties are abolished. You know, they are an extra tax which only foreign products have to bear. So their basic principle is treating foreign products in an unfair way. So now what happens if country B and A negotiate and agree on we abolish these customs duties for the trade between ourselves. Now, imagine that naturally country A and B do still want to levy customs duties for goods from the rest of the world and don't abolish customs duties completely. They just do it for the trade between each other, and so now goods can cross that border with a 0% tax burden. But if goods come from the outside world into country A, then we have tax burden, a customs duty of 5% on the value. Country B has a different decision. They charge goods from the outside world with 10%. Now, what would happen if you do not draw special consequences from this situation? Imagine you want to import something into country B. You are somebody from country C, and you have heard, well, this will cost you 10% of the price on top, and that is something which you probably don't like. So what are you going to do? Well, that was your plain way: import into country B, pay 10%. Now, the plain way is not always the best way. So think about an alternative route. From country C, the goods are sent to country A, imported there, you pay 5%, and then the goods cross the border. So that was far better than what you saw in the beginning. That is now far too expensive. You have a better route along here via country A, and then you only pay 5%. Consequence would be all third countries choose the alternative route, save the 5% customs duty, and then country B can forget its customs duties regime because it can always be avoided. Natural consequence from that is you still need a border control between country A and B, because that border control has to check if the goods which cross the border without customs duties really come from country A. If they come from the rest of the world, then country B will be completely entitled and will be absolutely reasonable to levy a customs duty on these products. So that seems to be clear. And this example shows that even if countries A and B decide to abolish customs duties, they cannot abolish the border controls between them because of the third country products. As you further see, at the border, the officers doing service there must be able to decide if a good which comes near the border and wants to cross the border comes from country A or comes from the rest of the world. That is one of the reasons why in international trade every transport of goods normally has to be accompanied by a certificate of origin, where somebody trustworthy certifies where that good was produced. if it comes from country C or if it comes from country A. Yeah. Now, naturally, if the rule is only goods which were produced in country A can cross the border free of customs duty, then you must naturally expect that some people are clever or want to be clever. So a nice idea would be to transport goods which are nearly finished at a customs rate of 5% into the area of country A, and then to finish them with a very, very small last step in country A, and now you could call them a product of country A. Yeah, for example, imagine you want to import a car into the territory of country B, so the car is nearly completely finished, and you transport the nearly finished car into country A, and the only thing which you do in country A is you paint the chassis there, or you do some other very, very simple job there, and then you say now it's a finished car, it's produced, has been finished in country A, and now it crosses the border. That naturally is too easy. That would also bring down the downfall of the complete customs regime and customs duty system of country B, so nobody tolerates that. And that explains why sometimes you hear that to get a certificate of origin, one needs to prove that a major, or at least a very important part, the value of the product must have been created in that other country. So if you only did 1% of the work in the territory of country A, that would be regarded as an immaterial, an absolutely unimportant part of the total work, and so the product would not be accepted as a product of country A. And so when it crosses the border, country B would charge it with the full customs duties which they levy on cars. So that naturally entails a bit of bureaucracy. Good. So what can we conclude from that first simple ideas? If two states want to remove the customs duties for the trade between them, they can do so. Such a thing is called a free trade agreement. But if they then uphold the customs duties for the outside world individually, then you still need border controls. And a free trade agreement is just this. Customs duties abolished between A and B, but still levied and differently levied for the rest of the world. Important examples for free trade areas are or were the classical European free trade area, the EFTA, was originally a kind of competing organization or alternative organization to the EU. Later, more and more of the EFTA member states crossed over into the EU until only a few of them were left, and 3 of them later formed together with the EU the European Economic Area, and that is an area where all the production or all the rules on economy were taken over from EU law, and where then in return for that all the customs duties between the 3 states of the EEA and the EU were abolished. Or you probably also still know about NAFTA. That was the North American Free Trade Agreement, which covered USA, Mexico, and Canada, and was later replaced by a similar but differently named new treaty between these states. The last question is if one and the same state or territory can belong to different free trade areas, and the answer is yes, because any free trade area agreement has only effect for the trade between these 2 countries and does not affect for trade with the rest of the world. So, for example, if state A has a free trade agreement with state B, then the goods from B can cross the border to A free of customs duties and the other way around. Also, state A can have a free trade agreement with goods with state C. Then goods can come free of customs duty into the territory of A. But now there are no effects for country B, because when the goods from C want to cross the A-B border, then the customs officers of state B will say, okay, you don't have your origin in state A, so this good cannot cross the border free of customs duties because it's not covered by our free trade agreement with country A. So indeed, it's possible to have different free trade agreements with many states, and nearly all important states have many different free trade agreements. The EU, for example, has a multitude of free trade agreements with the rest of the world. Good. Well, you could even go a step further and say we not only abolish the customs duties between our two states, we also agree on an identical customs tariff for imports from the rest of the world. In that situation, levying customs duties for all the goods between A and B is no longer necessary, because you do not have any more that difference between the 5% or the 10% rate. Then every product is charged by both countries at the same rate, so alternative routes of importation make no longer any sense. And so you can say every car which is in the territory of A is either produced there, or if it has been imported, it has been charged with, let's say, 7.5%, the common tax rate, the common customs duties rate on which they agreed in their agreement. So for customs duties, you do no longer need the border anymore. But naturally then, you need border control to the outside world. It must work properly everywhere, because you see, remember, if there is any single loophole across or in the border control somewhere in the common area, then within short time all the flow of goods would take that route, and then the customs regime would break down. So you need probably to coordinate in a customs union that all the border personnel works in a proper way and according to identical standards. The European Union is a classical example for a customs union, with at least two states, namely Andorra and Turkey, as associates, which take over the EU customs tariffs, and in return for that are allowed to have their own goods crossing the border without having to pay customs duties, because they are now members of the EU customs union. The only condition is, as the external tariff must be the same, these two countries are necessarily forced by agreements to take over the EU customs tariff into their own laws. Yeah? One of the effects, if you have a customs union, is that naturally no single member of that territory can change the customs tariffs alone. They have to do it together. And in the EU, naturally, that means they have shifted the competence to design or change the customs tariffs and the customs modalities to the EU, which then gets the right to issue the relevant provision, the relevant rules. Yeah. Okay. Now, what happens if you neither have a free trade agreement or a customs union? Then, in principle, goods crossing the border must expect to be taxed by customs duties. There has been created an international basic framework on these rules, and that developed at the end of the 1940s. It began with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and has been enlarged more and more, and because in the end there was a bigger bundle of treaties where one could lose the overview and where there also was some administrative work to do, one created a common organization which has the duty to supervise and to administer properly the rules in all these treaties. That was then the World Trade Organization, which began to function in 1955. The most important treaties in that treaty network, which forms the WTO framework, is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which contains many rules for the cross-border trade in goods. Then a General Agreement on Trade in Services, which is not quite so comprehensive, but at least contains some rules for cross-border services. Combined with especially the trade in goods is the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement called TRIPS. The idea is if a good can be freely exported to another country, and that good goes back to an invention made in country A. For example, it's a chemical drug, a medicine. Usually developing these things costs hundreds of millions. Now imagine somebody buys that medicine in country B, takes it to a laboratory, analyzes it, and then produces it for a cheap price. In that case, you would have an unfair advantage for that firm in state B if the invention were only protected in state A but not in state B. International trade would lead to the ruin of any firm which was willing to invest into research and development. Because once your invention would be finished, the others would order some pieces of your invention, copy it, and then later would send their imitated products without restrictions into your own country A, so that you do not only lose the export markets but also the inland market under the label of free trade. And that is what they want to avoid. So whoever wants to become a member of the WTO treaty network has to to sign also that TRIPS agreement. Naturally, one can also have some disputes or misunderstandings concerning is certain treatment of cross-border relations correct, or would it be forbidden under WTO rules. For this, there has been dispute settlement agreement or dispute settlement understanding, where rules are laid down how disputes between the WTO members can be solved. And last but not least, there is the Treaty on the Organization of the World Treaty Organization itself. Now, since the WTO has been created, the rule is that every state which wants to become a member of that system has to accept all these treaties together. You cannot opt out of one of them. Especially, for example, you have to sign the TRIPS agreement if you want to have free trade in goods and services. Otherwise, that's not possible. Now, the WTO, which has become very popular during that Brexit discussions in newspapers or broadcastings or so, the WTO rules consist mainly of, or rely on, or based on some selected principles. For example, one of the principles is that it's only a step-by-step approach. The aim of the WTO is the complete liberalization of cross-border trade as far as that can be made possible. But they say that is not a matter of a single day. That is a very long process. We are doing it gradually, so step by step, not complete removal, not a big bang solution, but small steps one after another. The idea is so we avoid shocks to the economies of the countries, which might result from enormous sudden changes in the trade rules and the trade situation. That seems to work properly because up to now no major problems have become known. Then a non-discrimination principle for foreigners. Wherever foreigners are allowed into a market, the WTO member states oblige themselves to accept foreigner as somebody with equal rights in courts and under the law. So it is no longer acceptable that a state makes a rule if a citizen of my own country and a foreigner have a dispute in court, the foreigner also always loses or has to comply with higher standards than my own people in legal matters. Wherever you allow them access to the market, foreign parties have the same rights as your own people under the law. Now, that naturally only applies if you allow them access to the market. Now, the next principle refers to exactly that. When you allow the citizens of one state, the firms of one state, access to your market, then you have to treat the nationals of all other WTO member states in the same way. So you are also not allowed to discriminate between citizens of different WTO states. That is called the most favored nation clause. It's not only to be found in WTO treaties, but also in most treaties on international commerce. It means always my citizens can claim equal treatment with any right which the other state granted to nationals of any other state in the world. So if Germany or if the EU gave free market access to Peruvians, then also people from Chile had the right to claim the same rights. You can always claim the rights of the most favored nation, which has a treaty with that state where you want to get to the market. And the last but not most unimportant clause is also the principle of reciprocity. No state is forced to liberalize the access to its market further without getting something in return from the other state which profits from that liberalization. And principles 3 and 4 are the main problems for a quick development, because if states A and B decide to liberalize export and imports, let's say for cars and for bicycles, state A says cars from state B can be imported freely now to my market, and state B says bicycles can be imported now from state A, then every other member state of the WTO can claim equal rights. So if A and B now sign that treaty, that also means that states C, D, E, F, G, H, and so on, 180 others, now have free access to the bicycle market of the one state and the car market of the other state. But these other 180 states gave nothing in return. Now they get it for free. Naturally, state A and state B will not like that situation. So most often state A and B say we are clear. So bicycles and cars, that's what we would agree on. But before we finally sign that treaty and therefore then give free access to our markets in that sectors to all the others in the world, let's go to the others, knock on their doors and ask them what they are willing to concede, because there's one thing we always agree on: we are not going to give them these advantages for free. So let's knock on their doors and ask them for concessions which they are willing to make. Now, if country C then says, okay, production machines for copying machines or for automatic teller machines can be now freely sent to my country, might be that A and B now look at each other and think, okay, seems adequate, okay, can live with that. Then A, B, and C naturally think, okay, if we are, then states D, E, F, and so on will profit from our agreement, which we three now made. So let's knock on their doors and ask what they are willing to give up. And that is the reason why the liberalization under the WTO rules took place mostly in mass discussions between diplomats, so-called world trade rounds, where everybody spoke with everybody else until they had a package which overall satisfied everybody, and where the chances for free riders were reduced to a minimum. Naturally, that takes years until they agree, and if one blocks the negotiations, and the question is, okay, do we proceed and liberalize the market, and then that guy, or better, that country which was not willing to make any agreeable concessions, that would then be a successful free rider, and that would be a very bad example for the others. So will we wait, and so on? So that's the reason why that more and more does not work properly. Now there is one way out of that. The WTO rules allow that the most favored nation clause does not need to be applied in cases where two states form a regional integration, where they say, okay, between us, like the EU, we skip all customs duties between us. So we just proceed already to the final stage of development, which is planned for customs duties, zero tariff. That is allowed because they say such a close regional integration, that's something where so many open and silent conditions are combined with, that you can probably not extend the whole package to people from other states. So free trade agreements and customs unions, these are the things which are still allowed in a bilateral, trilateral, or quadrilateral arena, without having to extend these privileges to all the rest of the world. And that is why more and more states talk about negotiations to conclude a free trade agreement, a comprehensive one, or customs unions. And that is why people say, if that fails, the negotiations of a comprehensive free trade agreement between two states, then the alternative is WTO rules. So applying our regular customs tariff to imports from all countries, but then in the same way if you lower the customs duties for imports from one country, that would be a violation of the most favored nation clause, and all the others could claim equal treatment. And naturally, when you deal with a country under the WTO rules, that would mean they levy their customs duties, you levy yours. And if you want to lower the customs duties, well, you can always lower yours, but then you can only do it with effect for all producers all over the world. And if you want to convince the other country to lower their customs duties, well, they already see, they all know that they can't do it without granting that reduction of the customs duties to all producers from all over the world. So a single country alone can probably not achieve this result. That is why in practice they all talk about free trade agreements or even about customs unions. Now, apart from customs duties, there is also indirect taxes. That is as you have already heard, the term for taxes on goods like tobacco tax, beer tax, tax on champagne, and so on, or the most comprehensive one, value-added tax. Now here you also have problems in cross-border trade. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, that you have country A and country B, and they have VAT systems and or tobacco taxes or what else you can imagine as a tax on a good. And now the tax rate in A shall be 10%, the tax rate in B shall be 20%, and our customer lives in country B. And now let's think about what might happen if the taxes are levied in the countries where the suppliers live and produce. Then we have supplier A, supplier B. Supplier A has costs of 100, including a small profit margin, has to add a tax of 10% on top, can offer a price of 110. Supplier B has also cost of 100, including the necessary small profit margin, has to add 20% tax, can offer for 120. So supplier A can offer 110, supplier B can offer for 120. It is no question at all where our customer will buy. If customer B is not completely strange, he will only buy from supplier A. And now every customer in country B is in that situation, and that leads to the effect that the customers in B only buy from the suppliers in A. So the suppliers, the economy in country B will be ruined, bankrupt, and gone after a while. And that is the reason why even in a customs union, as long as the indirect taxes are different, you have to have a border control, even if these people no longer claim customs duties. You will have to register which goods come to the inland, and then charge them with your value-added tax rate or your coffee tax or what else. You must absolutely make sure that goods coming from the outside world cannot be taxed at a lower level than your own products. This is, by the way, a different situation compared with customs duties. When you have customs duties, that is in itself an unfair concept. Foreign goods have to pay or are charged with that tax. Inland goods never. But here now you have the situation, all inland goods are charged with 20% value-added tax, or with €2.19 coffee tax per kilogram or so. And then if you allow foreign goods to come in without that taxation, then the foreigners have an unfair advantage. and they can ruin your economy. That must never be allowed, and that is why all states insist in all goods which come into my own country must be taxed under my law, because otherwise I cannot guarantee that they bear a tax burden which is sufficiently high. Good. From that, the basic principle in international indirect taxation results, that is the principle of taxation in the country of destination. Where the good goes to, there it will be taxed. That cannot be ensured without border controls. On the other hand, a logical consequence from that principle is also that exports will be left tax-free, because if you tax them in the country where they are produced with 10%, then the country where they go to taxes them at the border with 20%, then they are taxed with 30% in the total, and then the exporters can directly stay at home. They are too expensive to compete in the foreign country, and that is why every reasonable country leaves exports tax-free in indirect taxation. So you will only be taxed with indirect taxes in the country where the goods go to. What is seldom understood is that the tax exemption for exports also requires border controls. Because if you can prove to a supplier in country B, you produced 100,000 machines, and you sold them, where's the tax? Then the supplier could say, there is no tax paid here because I sold all these machines to customers in country A, so that was tax-free in my country as an export. And so everything's okay that I did not pay that tax. Now, if you accept this without a proof, then it's clear what happens next month. Supplier B just sells wildly in the inland to everybody but never pays tax. And when the tax inspection comes, he just brings forward, I exported all this stuff. And you, the tax administration, could not prove the opposite. So border controls are necessary, because if you want to free exports from tax, you will do it in a way that the supplier, the producer, or whoever it is, has to prove that that good left the country and can never come back undetected. And for this purpose, you need border control. If you renounce on that, then it's a clear thing that your producers would begin to cheat. And that must be absolutely avoided. Yeah. So, even in a customs union, you will have to insist in a border control. You can only renounce on that if you have very, very strictly working other way and well-functioning ways of controlling the flow of goods between the two countries. And if you don't have a strict border control, that other mechanisms will probably not function perfectly. So additionally, the states will insist in that their tax laws are so similar that if there are problems or small gaps in the checks, where goods go to, that the tax is also similar, that the damage done cannot really ruin the economy of one of the countries involved. And so if you do not agree on a very, very strict common legislation, which is very binding for both and which leads to a very close everyday coordination and cooperation between all the authorities involved, then this cannot work. Another last aspect in that field of taxation and customs duties is, naturally, when you have a border control, you have to show your goods, have to give the officers documents where they come from, which goods they are, so that they can apply the customs tariffs and can check if you tell them the truth. And now you have to hand in customs declarations that you have to set rules for that, forms, returns, and so. And now that can easily bring a mass of bureaucracy. Imagine you are a firm which does not only export the goods to one country, but to 100 different countries. Then you would have to learn the declaration rules and the rules how to call your goods in the language of 100 and the forms of 100 different countries. Congratulations! You probably can never do anything else. That would probably not work. Or it might even be that one good on its transport, during its transport, has to cross several borders. So every border control would want to know what is in the truck, check it, and then say, okay, you can go on. And for all this, you have to hand in the right declarations from the perspective of that country on which border you are at the moment. So Russia, China, North Korea, South Korea, don't know. So every border which you cross, you would have to fill out the correct documents in a correct way. And also that would be unbearable. And for this reason, although unnoticed by most people, there are huge efforts to standardize the customs declarations forms everywhere in the world, as far as that can be done without affecting the possibilities of the countries to decide how much they tax which goods. So especially the classification of goods and the way how they are called, that is harmonized nearly worldwide by a so-called harmonized system, or in the language of the EU, sometimes called a combined nomenclature, which means if you once found out how a good has to be called and classified in the customs system of one country, it's highly plausible that you can declare it in absolutely the same way when you cross the border to the next country, and that is a huge, huge advantage. Now, when we go to the third problem, standardization of products, or product standards and production standards, the most interesting aspect there is that usually when you are an outsider and don't work in that sector of industry, you probably regard all these rules as complete madness, because you don't understand why they are necessary. And that is why you usually read newspaper articles where people, journalists, talk about the complete nonsense rules which exist there. But if you know a bit more of the problems, then probably you could understand these things which at first glance seem to be complete nonsense. Imagine there is a law, now that's fiction, that containers which inflame with gas which can explode must be painted with the warning color, let's take yellow. Well, so you know that and everybody else knows, if you see a car in front of you, a lorry which transports container, and they're all yellow, it is not recommendable to have a crash with that car because it will explode. Or it probably is not a good idea to lean on such a container when you want to light a cigarette and enjoy a break. Might be that this break is going to take a longer time. Now, naturally, if you don't think about the problems, you probably don't see a reason why gas containers should always be painted yellow. Well, Now, when you see the first truck drivers are usually not people who like to read um, huge forms, and usually they are not former tax advisors, so they are probably more the practical kind of people. Now, when you see the first truck driver leaning over such gas containers and smoking a cigarette, then you probably begin to think differently about that duty to mark all these containers in a warning color which every idiot knows. By the way, 30 years ago, my father inspected a firm, and there the employees had, in the course of time, chosen a particular corner in the court of the factory building for having their smoker's break, and there was some pipe half a meter above them, and it was very dusty, and so they cleaned it, and they saw it was painted in yellow. So they just had their smoking break regularly under the gas pipeline, which really gives you a good feeling. The father was very proud that after cleaning that pipeline, they found out what it was, and so the smoker's corner was shifted to somewhere else. Now imagine everybody knows that yellow is danger, and now gas containers from another country are produced in a way that they are painted pink. No problem. In faraway Eastern, everybody knows if a container is pink, stay away from that, don't smoke, be cautious. Now this container crosses the border. Truck driver changes, new truck driver takes over, container is pink. Truck driver wants to make a smoking break. Why not? Well, thinks about, can I? Looks to the containers, okay, yes, they are pink. No reason to be nervous. If they were dangerous, they would be yellow. Well, okay, for your country that's true. Not for the countries where the containers come from. There, pink is the danger. You don't know, no problem. After the big explosion, you will know. That sounds far-fetched, but this is exactly the problems which you meet. And you see that such a strange detail can be absolutely dangerous, because can cost many lives. And so you have to talk about all these things, and you have to harmonize such standards. Very often you have either to block the entry of such goods into your country, or you have to agree on harmonized standards. Might be that both countries agree, okay, it does not really matter if the danger warning color is yellow or pink. The only thing which matters is that it is a warning color which everybody knows and which is then known to everybody. So one might agree to, okay, in the future, let's renounce on yellow and pink. Let's turn to green. Might work. The only thing which you need to achieve is a common solution where in the future everybody knows every green container is a far away container. Don't smoke there and don't throw it away. Throw it about. Far too dangerous. Very often, this is indeed what then people do. They talk on a often worldwide scale on identical harmonization, identical standards for such things, so that these problems can be solved. Very often, by the way, if you go into details, what politicians very often don't know is that many production and product standards are not really made on a national level anymore. and not even on an EU level anymore, but the local parliaments of EU or of a state usually get a recommendation from some expert organization which deals with the problem worldwide and recommends to a parliament to adopt this standard for its nation too. And then some wise people in parliament will explain their colleagues there is no alternative to saying yes. And so in the end, they still have the illusion they decide, but in reality, that happens on a worldwide scale. And by the way, as long as we have to deal with things like should the warning color be yellow or pink or green, that is not really a problem where you can protest that you now lose your sovereignty. If your sovereignty depends on your feeling that you are your own lords, depends on who gives the decision for the warning colors for gas containers or similar things, then you have a problem. And then you can't distinguish the unnecessary details, unimportant things which do not decide really about your personal life from the things which really matter. Yeah, in the EU, one has solved all these standardization problems in a brutal way, in a very good and convincing way, because the EU has got the competence to make own laws with effect for all the member states, so that harmonized standards or common rules for the economy can be created wherever necessary on the EU level and then take effect in the same way in all the parts of the market. Some rules are already laid down in the treaties and others are made by the EU institutions themselves, so-called secondary law. For example, customs duties are regulated completely on the EU level. Indirect taxes, there the EU gives a framework to which all indirect taxes of the member states have to comply, so the basic system is at least the same, and the taxes must be designed by the member states in a way that no border controls are necessary. And for product standards and others, especially there, you can expect common legislation, and there are two kinds of common legislation: a regulation, which is nothing else than a full law which can produce duties and rights for the citizens immediately, or it can be a directive that is rather a binding order to the member states that they have to insert certain smaller rules into their existing rules, so that a certain point of the legislation, a certain detail will in the future be identical in all the laws of the member states, so that obstacles from the laws being different fall away automatically. Naturally, if you are interested or if you have to do with economy, with business, and look to international relations in that context, you must absolutely be familiar with European Union law and knowing the different ways how the EU can make laws and which type of laws it has, and how this law is interpreted. All that is absolutely vital for getting familiar with what is really going on nowadays in the economy. So wherever you can get information on EU law, try to get it and don't forget it. So what you absolutely will have to know about the EU for the rest of your lives probably is: what is a regulation? What is a directive? How does the EU make its laws? Who does interpret European Union laws? EU law is binding for the member states. They can't deviate from it. It overrules any contrary national law. and you must know which rules are laid down in the treaties themselves, so that even the EU Commission can't change these rules. So-called fundamental freedoms are the most relevant ones. That is not the citizen freedoms, but or political freedoms. These are market freedoms from the beginning of the EU history, where the EU was restricted to a purely economic community. So the fundamental freedoms are the freedom of workers, the freedom of establishment for business owners, the freedom of goods, services, and capital across the borders of the EU, and some other things. So try to get familiar with these things too, and then you have a basic understanding of what's relevant for international trade. Good. Now the blank last slide gives you a certain message. The chapter is over. I thank you for surviving until now. Hope you could obtain some useful information here, and would like to see you again soon.